she is the superstar.
Well, I tell you,
She-
well, so well, this last trip was family vacation with my stepson and his two daughters. So we got to spend some really quality time, on the ship. And it was a wonderful ship. It was in the sea, and I had never been on one. And it was like a super ship. It was like it held 5,000 passengers. It was huge. Anyway, so thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
start the.
And then I have onions.
Oh, yeah.
And I have,
Stuff that's not too huge.
yeah,
Put in that
I
bed.
have onions, and in my round bed I have onions, and then I have,
Don, will you do opening prayer today? Thank you. Let's open up to number 100. 100. It's one we haven't sang in a while. But we'll do both verses on this one. Holy ground. The text there is Exodus 3, verse 5. The place where you're standing is holy ground. This is holy ground. We're standing on holy ground. For the Lord is present, and where he is holy. This is holy ground. We're standing on holy ground. For the Lord is present, and where he is holy. You are holy, God, a perfect and holy God. We will come before you with hearts made clean by Jesus' blood. You are holy, God, a perfect and holy God. We will come before you with hearts made clean by Jesus' blood. All right, our next song will be 121. It's 121. And I think I know this one, but you guys might have to help me carry it once we get it started. But again, that's 121. Come, let us all unite to sing. God is love. Let heaven, earth their praises bring. God is love. Let every soul from sin awake, each in his heart sweet music make, and sing with us for Jesus' sake, for God is love. God is love. God is love. Come, let us all unite to sing that God is love. Oh, tell to earth's remotest bound, God is love. In Christ we have redemption found. God is love. His blood has washed our sins away. His Spirit turned our night to day. And now we can rejoice to say that God is love. God is love. God is love. Come, let us all unite to sing that God is love. How happy is our portion here. God is love. His promises our spirits cheer. God is love. He is our sun and shield by day, our help, our hope, our strength and stay. He will be with us all the way. Our God is love. God is love. God is love. Come, let us all unite to sing that God is love. Come, let us all unite to sing that God is love. Done.
Let's pray. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this day and for all your many blessings. We pray that you would be with us as we study your word and we would take into our hearts and minds the things that we learned this evening. We pray that you be with all those on our prayer list that need your special care and attention, and that you would help them and give them strength and support in their challenging times in life. We pray, Father, that you would always be our guide and director in our lives, and that we would always live lives the lives that Christians should on this earth. These things we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Yeah, I think we're on. Yep. Let's open up to Mark chapter 5. So we're going to be spending our time as we continue to work our way through this great gospel. Now, here in Mark chapter 5, we're entering into a new section of Mark's gospel. It really dovetails off the conclusion of chapter 4, where we read and discussed the calming of the storm that occurred as Jesus and his apostles were crossing the Sea of Galilee. And so since Jesus calmed the storm, we learn in verse 1 of chapter 5 that they successfully crossed the Sea of Galilee. And the text says there in verse 1, they came to the other side of the sea into the country of the Gerasenes. Now this is a stage-setting verse, and Mark is recording for us here the safe arrival of Jesus and his apostles to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. They come to this place called the country of the Gerasenes. Now, depending on your translation, this place has also been called the country of the Gadarenes, and in some renditions, it's been called the country of the Gergesenes. Again, that depends on your translation. Now, since those differences exist, the exact location as to this place where Jesus and his apostles landed is uncertain, but all we know from the text is that the place Jesus and his apostles arrived to after crossing the Sea of the Galilee was to this place. It was somewhere on the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee, which was outside the land of Israel. So they're not in the land of Israel, they're somewhere just across the border from it on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, it's going to become important a little bit later. Anything else on verse 1 that needs to be addressed? Okay. So again, this is a stage-setting verse. This verse sets the stage for the story Mark will go on to tell about someone that Jesus encountered as he came to this place. And this individual that Jesus encountered is an individual that has come to be known simply as the Gerasene demoniac. And the reason for that is because this man that Jesus encountered was possessed by not one demon, but multiple demons, as we'll see in the story. So it's this man's story that deals with his encounter and relationship with Jesus that we're going to spend time with as we examine 2 points from the text of verses 2 through 13 that Mark makes through his telling of this story. And they're all about this man, the Gerasene demoniac. First point we'll examine from verses 2 through 5 is that the Gerasene demoniac met Jesus. We'll look at that. And the second point we'll examine from verses 6 through 13 is that the Gerasene demoniac pleaded with Jesus. Now, after looking at these things, then what we'll learn from these verses is that we too will encounter Jesus in one way or another. And we'll discuss that when we get there. But let's read this story beginning in verse 2, and then we'll look at the points. Again, we're in Mark chapter 5, beginning in verse 2. When he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him, and he had his dwelling among the tombs. And no one was able to bind him any more, even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains, and gashing himself with stones. Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him. And shouting with a loud voice, he said, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you, by God, do not torment me." For he had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And he was asking him, "What is your name?" And he said to him, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he began to implore him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain. The demons implored him, saying, "Send us into the swine so that we may enter them." Jesus gave them permission, and coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea. So, we're reading this story about the Gerasene demoniac and his relationship with Jesus, for the lack of a better term. Mark introduces this point in verse 2. Jesus gets out of the boat. And what are we told about this man here in verse 2? He had an unclean spirit, and he was a man from the tombs. Now, what do we usually associate with tombs? A graveyard. Dead people are there. Just tonight, I drove past the Price City Cemetery. Dead people, all in one place. So Mark adds this detail for us, but yes, this man, he had this unclean spirit, but he adds this detail about the tombs, possibly to emphasize the fact that he did have an unclean spirit. Now, I'm going to ask you this, just a little quiz. Under Jewish law, what were you considered if you came into contact with a dead person? Unclean. So this man, we don't know if he's a Jew or not, he'd be unclean under Jewish law. He's running around dead people. And so he has this unclean spirit, but we're going to see what this unclean spirit is about in a few verses. The main reason he was unclean is because he was possessed by multiple demons, collectively known as Legion, as we'll see in verse 9. We'll come back to that. Anything else on verse 2? Okay. So in verse 3, Mark goes on to establish the point that we've kind of already been introduced to in verse 2. Where is he living? Among the tombs, the text says. So But what else does verse 3 tell us? No one could bind him. What does it mean to bind someone? To tie him up. So part of what's implied here is there were people who were trying to tie this man up on multiple occasions, but no one could do it, even with a chain. Now, what does a chain do? It's to restrain. So yeah, to restrict, Elaine said. Yeah, there's restraints. But what kind of a restraint is a chain? It's a very strong one. So they couldn't even tie him up with a chain. Now, what does this tell us about this man? He's very strong and active. But what's making him strong? The demons, exactly. This unclean spirit. Now, so far we haven't run into the word demons. It's just unclean spirit, but we do know this is equated with demons. So, he's very strong, is what we're beginning to learn here in verse 3. Anything else on verse 3? Okay. So verse 4, Mark continues his description. The text says, because he had been often bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. So according to this verse, what are people attempting to do? To keep him under control. That's what the subduing is about. There were people that were trying on multiple occasions trying to overpower him with shackles and chains, but they couldn't do it. But what might also be suggested here is that this man was mistreated by others because he had this unclean spirit. So when you look at the scribes and Pharisees' dealings with these kinds of people, they don't treat them kindly. So this man seems to be living in a life of torment, not only by these demons he's possessed by, but by the way people are treating him because he's possessed by these demons. Anything else on verse 4? Okay. So verses 2 through 4 are more about the character of this man, who he is. Verse 5 gets into what he's doing. What's he doing in verse 5? And cutting himself, gashing himself with stones. So in this verse, Mark is moving from a description of this man's strength in verses 2 through 4, and now it's his mental state. Now let's put ourselves in this circumstance. Today, if you see someone doing something like this, what are you going to think? Okay, they're on drugs. That's one. They've got problems. Now, drugs could definitely have something to do with it. But yes, it's this man's mental state that he's in. Now, we've all, at least I think we've all been in the mountains around here at one point or another. Now, imagine being up there. There's someone who might be a hiker, but they're just running around screaming, cutting themselves with these stones that they found up in our mountains. It'd be a frightening sight. And you'd begin to ask yourself, why? This man, it's happening because of what these demons are doing to him. Questions or comments on verse 5? Okay. So he has this unclean spirit. He's suffering from some form of insanity, is a word that's been used in regard to him. And he's screaming at the top of his lungs, causing himself injury. Not just every once in a while, but how often? Night and day, or day and night, whatever order you want to use. Every day. So he's not only screaming, but he's probably bloody because he's doing this to himself every single day. So putting verses 2 through 5 together, the point we should see about the Gerasene demoniac, as he's been called, is that he met Jesus. This may have been the first person Jesus saw as soon as he got off the boat. But these were the kinds of people that Jesus dealt with. As early as chapter 1 in Mark's gospel, Jesus is in a synagogue, might be chapter 2. But there's an unclean spirit person in that synagogue. But these are the kinds of people that Jesus dealt with. This isn't something new that's going on. It's what we would call an insane individual that Jesus is dealing with. All because he had this unclean spirit. And here he's encountering Jesus. Anything else on before we move on to verses 6 through 13? All right. So next, verses 6 through 13, the second point, the Gerasene demoniac pleaded with Jesus. So we begin in verse 6. What happens in verse 6? Ran up to him and bowed down. Now, what's this bowing? When you're bowing down before someone, what does that indicate? Respect. This man has some respect for Jesus. Now, remember verse 5. He's running around screaming, cutting himself with stones. Verse 6, at least for a moment, he collects himself because he sees Jesus, runs up to him, and bows down because there's some respect for Jesus there. Now, from the context of Mark's gospel, one reason that we know that respect is there is because before this point, even if nobody else did, the unclean spirits recognized the authority of Jesus. They understood who Jesus was, who he is. Anything else on verse 6? All right. So verse 7, this man comes to Jesus, and what happens next in verse 7? And what's he saying? Son of the Most High God. Now, what does that say about who Jesus is, that he's the Son of the Most High God? It's the top of the line. This title for God, Most High God, means he's in charge. So for Jesus to be of the Son of the Most High God, what does that say about Jesus? Second in command. Jesus is in charge. Now, so this man recognizes this about Jesus. More specifically, it's the unclean spirit inside him. But what else does the unclean spirit inside this man say? Okay, you have the word adjure there. Okay, some translations have that. New American Standard has the implore word. But what's this unclean spirit doing with that word, adjure or implore, or whatever one? Okay, he's requesting. But the word implore or adjure takes it one step further. He's begging him not to torment him. What's another word for torment? Persecute, harass, torture is probably the most appropriate word. Saying, don't torture me, Jesus. I know who you are. Please don't torture me. But by Mark recording this, this is what he's helping his readers to see, who Jesus is. But through the eyes of these unclean spirits that Jesus has been dealing with up to this point. So he's begging, do not torment, do not torture me. I know who you are. Please don't torture me. But it's preceded, of course, by this question. Now, the New American Standard reads, what business do we have with each other? But a better translation is, what do we have to do with each other? Leave me alone, Jesus. Don't torture me. Now, verse 8, why is this demon requesting or begging this? What has Jesus been doing? Okay, taking the unclean spirits out. But what has he been saying in verse 8 to this particular unclean spirit? Come out of the man. Now, does the unclean spirit want to come out of the man? No. That's where the torment comes on. This unclean spirit is fighting against the authority of Jesus. At the end of the day, this unclean spirit knows he has to obey Jesus. But that doesn't mean he's not going to fight against his authority. So again, he's pleading with Jesus is what we're seeing. Anything else on verses 7 or 8 before we go to verse 9? Okay. So Jesus is not only saying, come out of the man, you unclean spirit. What else does Jesus say in verse 9? What's your name? What's the unclean spirit's name? Legion. Why? There are many. Can anyone tell me what a legion is? That close. It's 6,000. You were close, Don. A Roman legion is 6,000 Roman soldiers. But this does not necessarily mean there are 6,000 demons. Because the text doesn't specify. All this demon says is we are many. He doesn't say we are this amount. He just says we are many. But yes, a Roman legion is 6,000 Roman soldiers. So we might safely assume that there's at least 1,000 demons possibly possessing this man. A multiplicity of demons in one man. This is why he's screaming. This is why he's cutting himself. Because he doesn't know what to do about it. So he's doing the best he can. Anything else on verse 9? Okay. So verse 10, the begging continues. Here in verse 10, what is this multiplicity of demons begging Jesus not to do? To not send them out of the country. So, as we come to verse 10, at this point in the story, something we should understand is that since verse 7, Mark has been referring to the man with the unclean spirit, both in the singular and in the plural. I don't know if you've caught that. Now, just going back to verse 7 really quick. Okay, there it is. Flip my page back one moment. So verse 7, or I'll bring that out at the end. Sorry. I'll bring that out when we wrap up this point. But yes, this unclean spirit saying, don't send us out of the country. That word country can also be translated as land. Don't kick us out of here, Jesus. But it's a plea. Let us stay here. Now, verse 1, where are they? The Gerasenes. So the demons are saying, let us stay here, Jesus. Sure, we'll come out of this man, but don't make us leave. Let us stay here. So verse 11 introduces a side note. What's going on? What's nearby? Swine. What are swine? Pigs. Now, how do the Jews feel about pigs? They're unclean. They don't like them. We've heard the expression that would go about as well as a pork chop in a synagogue. It's bad. So since there is a large herd of swine nearby, what does this tell us about where they are? It's not Jewish country. This is one reason we know they're not in Israel anymore. From north to south, you're not going to find a herd of pigs anywhere when you're in Israel. Step across the river, pigs everywhere. Because it's not Jews on the other side of the river. At least not as many as there are in Israel. So, there's this large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain. But this is another stage-setting verse for verse 12. Anything else through verse 11? Questions or comments? It's a pretty horrible circumstance. And again, we learned from verse 5, he's doing this every day and every night. So now we're seeing the unclean spirit. They're begging Jesus, don't send us away. We come to verse 12. Where do they want to go? Into the pigs. So they're begging Jesus, Jesus, don't send us away from here. Don't make us leave. There's some pigs over here. Send us there. Now also, given that the demons make this request to be sent into something that was unclean under Jewish law, that again only adds to the fact that the demons were also unclean in nature. Now, since that's true, what happens in verse 13? They get their wish. Off the deep end, quite literally speaking. How many pigs are there? About 2,000. Now again, don't read too much into this to say there's 2,000 demons. I mean, it's possible, but the text doesn't specify that. All we know is there was 2,000 pigs, and the demons, however they went into all of them. And the pigs die. They go just as crazy as the man was. So Jesus sends them into the pigs, and this results in the demons being destroyed in that way. Anything else on verse 13? Okay. So putting verses 6 through 13 together, the point we should see from these verses about the Gerasene demoniac's relationship with Jesus is that he pleaded with Jesus. In these verses, there are 3 different pleas. First one is verse 7. Do not torment or torture us, Jesus, is what they say. Plea number 2, verse 10. They say, don't send us out of the country. And finally, plea number 3, send us into the pigs. Now again, when you read these verses, there's an alternation between the singular and plural. So it seems that there's also an alternation, yeah, that's the right word, that in some cases it's the man himself speaking, and in other cases it's these demons speaking through him. Does that make sense? Okay. But at the end of the day, after all this begging, these demons are destroyed because they go into the pigs go off the cliff and die. And by all accounts, this man is never bothered again. And we're going to stop there. This story does continue beginning in verse 14, but this is the end of this section of the story. But putting verses 1 through 13 together, the point we should be left with is that the Gerasene demoniac had an encounter with Jesus. He met him, and he pleaded with him. So the application to us is the same. We will encounter Jesus in one way or another. Now, Mark has recorded one of the many instances that someone encountered Jesus. The result of this encounter was that this man was freed. That's what this story is about, is how this man, possessed by multiple, a legion of demons, was freed. Now, the comment was made, you see someone screaming and cutting themselves, they're on drugs. That might be true. Now, I have friends who have overcome addiction of drugs. You've met one of them, David Stewart. If you remember, not long after I got here, he was with us for a while. Now, he wasn't doing these kinds of things, screaming and cutting himself. But in some cases, people on drugs do that. But when they're released from those drugs, when they've overcome that addiction, those behaviors stop. It's freedom. That's what Jesus gave to this man, was freedom. These demons didn't have the choice but to obey. Now, they fought, but they still had to obey. But what Mark wants us to see is that this man received freedom. That's what an encounter with Jesus leads to, is freedom. Now, what kind of freedom does Jesus give us? Spiritual. It's a spiritual kind of freedom. What are we freed from? Our sins. Now, do you know demon possession does happen today? Not in the way the religious world talks about, but every time sin takes a hold of us, we are possessed by demons. And there's only one way out of that circumstance: an encounter with Jesus. So will we seek to encounter Jesus, experience the kind of freedom that only Jesus can give? Now again, these are just some applications from this text. Any other questions or comments? I hope so. I hope it's made at least some sense tonight. Dean, will you close us tonight? Thanks.